Since that period, the big crisis in agriculture has been overproduction, not underproduction. And whoever talks to you about, we need to feed the world, we'll have many conversations about this in the semester, should be reminded that most of the time, including now, the problem for farmers and the problem for the planet is too much food, not too little food. And they focused, in particular, farmers were encouraged to focus on corn and soy. There was a lot of research on them. They were good partners in the field because the corn was a legume, which means it fixes a little bit of nitrogen itself, and it would take turns. And it still does take turns. Corn and soy rotation is the rotation of American agriculture. Now, this regime works because of cheap oil and because of the perversity of farm economics. There's a strange phenomenon in farming. It's a little different than other businesses. When you're in another business and the price, let's say you make cars, and the price of cars is falling because people aren't buying cars, what you do is you close down an assembly line. You shrink production until demand and supply catch up. Farmers don't think that way. Farmers in general are small businessmen and women operating in a very large economy. And they're more concerned about cash flow than anything else. So if the price of corn falls 10%, and it was steadily falling through the 70s and 80s, their first instinct is not to get all together and cut down on corn production, which would be the rational thing to do if they were sufficiently well organized or the government could help them organize. No, it's to produce 10% more corn. So you stay even. You can pay your note and take care of all your expenses. So you have this vicious circle where farmers, as prices go down, produce more, and prices go further and further down, and you get this great oversupply of crops. And we did, and that's exactly what the government wanted to happen. One of the key things about food to keep in mind is, and this affects what's happening in the politics of food today, is that political leaders love cheap food. Because when they don't have it, they lose their head sometimes. They learned that during the French Revolution. And the dictators in the Arab world learned that in 2008 and 2009 and 2010. So there's enormous pressure to keep food prices low no matter what the cost of doing that. And I think you see that with the Obama administration, where taking any steps to make the system more sustainable that would raise prices are just simply not something that they want to consider. But this works. Food got cheaper, and the percentage of the food the percentage of our income we use on food went down, 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 down. But even though it still looked like farms, it was a whole new ecology, a whole new ecosystem. The logic of ecology or biology is replaced by the logic of the factory. So you go from this circular system where each species is in a kind of synergistic relationship with another to a factory model where you take these inputs, seeds, fertilizer, water, pesticides, and then you get these outputs. And then you have some waste along the way. And that's kind of where we are. And basically what we do now is we use sunlight and oil to create a lot of corn. And then this corn does all sorts of things in the economy and in the food system. Why corn? Well, a couple reasons. It's a very productive plant. It's one of the best ways to get carbohydrate energy off of land and sun. But then the other reasons I talked about, the intellectual property is controllable. It lends itself to mechanization. You can plant it with machines. You can harvest it with machines. It's a great crop. But we're putting 50 gallons of oil on our cornfields every year in the form of fertilizer and diesel and things like that. What would be more efficient, of course, is if we could simply drink that oil directly. But that doesn't happen yet. This is wildly successful. As I said, we go from 40 bushels of corn per acre to before World War II to more than 200. And this flood of cheap corn, which I detail if you want to read more about it in the first third of Omnivore's Dilemma, revolutionizes the food system down the line. It leads to this consolidation of farms and the farm depression in the 1980s. We go from 10 million farms to less than 2 million almost overnight. And from each farmer feeding, what did I say, 20 people or 40 people? We moved to one farmer now able to feed 150 people. These are incredibly productive, some of the most productive individuals who have ever lived. One person feeds 150 other people. It's also led to the exodus of animals from farms because they were focusing on one crop. And also it was no longer profitable to grow food to feed your cattle or pigs, because there was this subsidized corn that was dirt cheap that was in the market that you could buy for less than it cost to grow it. So there's an exodus of animals off of farms and onto feedlots. And there are many incentives to create feedlots built into the tax code and beginning in the 60s and into the 70s. So the factory idea that was on the farm now comes to the raising of animals on feedlots, the kind of scene that I saw at Harris Ranch. Now, this is a great boon from several perspectives. As I said, the percentage of an American's income spent on food goes from, in 1910, 24%, to 1960, 18%, and today, less than 9.5%. That is less than any people in the history of humanity, any people anywhere else in the world right now. We spend less on food than anybody. So you have to count this an achievement. But you also, at the same time, have to recognize that it's insidious and creates all sorts of problems. The falling price of food has now become a linchpin of the economy, makes it very hard to change the food system, because anything you do to it to improve it, let's say you want to remove antibiotics from livestock, you find that the price will go up a little bit. But now there are millions of people who are dependent on cheap food. It's baked into our society now. And very hard to change. And it is the reason, I would contend, that we have put up with falling wages in this country since the 1970s. Food was getting cheaper. Cheap food subsidized the collapse in wages. So what other costs? Well, it turns out cheap food is incredibly expensive if you take a holistic and ecological view of the real costs. And I'll just run through these quickly. It means you need a chemically dependent agriculture to produce at these levels. Monoculture depends on heavy chemical intervention. And this word monoculture, I think, is one of the key terms to take with you through the semester. So many of the problems of modern agriculture are the result of monoculture. Because when you grow too much of the same thing, you create a banquet for pests. And they will have, their population will explode because they have endless supply of food. And they will be there year after year. And the way you deal with it is chemicals. If you're willing to diversify, you don't need pesticides, or you don't need many pesticides. And so most of the things you worry about in our food system, whether you worry about GMOs, whether you worry about pesticides, trace to the fact that our agriculture relies on monocultures. Second point. This is an oil-dependent food chain. That is a powerful and new ingredient in the way we grow food. There are fossil fuels in the fertilizer, the pesticides, the farm machinery, the processing, the long-distance transportation, and these new global supply chains. It is the reason why it makes sense to move food all over the world the way we do. To catch supposedly sustainable salmon in Alaska, ship them to China as we do, have them filleted there, and then ship them back to the United States and sometimes to Alaska. It is the reason why we export sugar cookies to Denmark and import sugar cookies from Denmark. A trade that an economist in the 70s pointed out. He said, wouldn't it be more efficient to simply swap recipes? But in an era of cheap oil, why not? Why not? So oil is really key. And it means that when we eat from the industrial food chain, we are eating oil, and a lot of it. How much of it? Well, that's what my burger is here for, and that little pitcher of oil. And let me just show you how much oil goes into that.